Good evening and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about cell phones, their microphones, and the impact of the microphone placement on the quality of the recording and in particular the intensity of the sound that gets recorded. So most cell phones, are the standard package of a rectangle like that. And when we see them used, we see it such that a person standing there holding their cell phone in their hand, such that it's kind of like this. And the reason that's the case is that, one is from your little eyeballs you can see the phone, and the other reason is of course that this mouth then is located close to the speaker, which is purposely put on right on the end. So in this larger picture over here, we often find that on the vast majority of phones, the microphone, that was a microphone up there, microphone is located on one end or the other. Now there are, advanced models of phones that have up to four microphones, but by and large, the vast quantity of the cell phones on the market are these, or smartphones, whatever you want to call them, are located on one end or the other. So let's think about that for a moment. Let's say you're standing there and you want to record sound, and let's go ahead and erase what's up there. Let's say we've got some sound that's coming from this direction, and we've got this cell phone that we put in its path, and there's something out here, some activity out there that we want to record. So we hold the cell phone up like this, and with the microphone on the bottom, the sound comes along in this direction and hits the cell phone, or arrives at the cell phone, however you want to look at it. So now the question becomes, what sound gets recorded? Well, the microphone is pointed at the ground down here, in case there's some ground or something. So even if the microphone is built to be quote unquote omnidirectional, it's still going to have a greater intensity or greater recording capacity for sounds which reach it directly, which will be directly off the ground, which in this case, there'll be some reflections that occur that probably get recorded at a louder volume than, say, the direct sound. Of course, there is the issue of how far away it is and how much of the sound gets attenuated or decreased in intensity because of the longer path between the reflected path, which, the reflected path being this one, versus the direct path being that way. So now let's think about that for a moment. How does that impact the nature of the recordings that we hear from Vegas? So most people were either holding their cell phone horizontal like that when they were recording, in which case the microphone's going to be on one end or the other, or they were holding them like this, in which case the microphone's going to be pointed down at the ground. So due to the nature of the sound, higher frequencies of sound are more directional. And so let's draw a little picture. If we have a high frequency sound, and by high frequency I mean on the order of 10 kilohertz, that's at the upper end of the hearing range. So if we have a 10 kilohertz signal and it's being broadcast out from some point in the distance, and you stick a substantial size obstacle in its way, then the sound does not pass through it, and when it gets to the edge here, it leaves a shadow. And this, these should all be such that behind the building there's a region where the sound is substantially decreased. and it's a function of the signal frequency. If we have a low frequency signal on the order of 100 hertz, for example, then that same phenomena with the same size object as before, sound sometimes it will go through, sometimes it won't. Depends upon the resonant frequency of the building. But anyway, as it comes around the edges, it almost immediately gets back together such that there's very little dead room, as you would call it, behind the building. So the width of this object is what determines, relative to the size of the wave of these things, is what determines how small this dead zone is. So, for example, the general rule is, and this is just a general rule, you can go research this in greater depth if you want to. The general rule is that if the wavelength, okay, so bear with me here, I'll explain wavelength. If the wavelength of the sound is approximately equal to the size of the object, then the sound will be blocked or refracted off or reflected off, or whatever you want to call it. If the wave is substantially larger than the size of the object, then as the sound goes past it, it will bend inwards behind the object, and the object will almost become transparent. So what we have to know is then what these frequencies produce. So a 1000 hertz signal, which is basically, this is a sine wave, and for one complete cycle, that's what we call the wavelength. That's the wavelength. And for a wave that there are 1,000 of per second, then we have this being the time for one complete cycle. Then is 1 over 1,000. This is the time now, and that equals 1 millisecond, 1,000th of a second, milliseconds as we would call them. So how long is that? Well, that depends upon the speed of sound. But if the speed of sound, which we'll call C0 for speed of sound, at a particular location, which varies by temperature, elevation, all that, but let's just assert that it's 1,000 feet per second. Okay. In this case, then, a 1 millisecond portion of that would be 1 foot, or you simply multiply the 1 over the frequency to get the time of one cycle, multiply it by the sound, and 1/1000th of a second times 1,000, and so this wavelength for a 1 kilohertz signal would be 1 foot. Okay, so from the start to the end of that is 1 foot if the speed of sound is 1,000 feet per second for a 1 kilohertz signal. So if we jump up to a 10 kilohertz signal, or 10,000 hertz, or 10,000 cycles per second, then if we calculate out the time of one cycle, which is 1 over that, or basically it would be 0.1 millisecond, which when we multiply by 1,000 becomes 0.1 feet, or a little bit more than 1 inch. So for a 10 kilohertz signal, then the signal becomes let's just call it 1 inch for easy purposes. So for a 10 kilohertz signal, any object that's bigger than an inch is going to block the signal substantially and create that dead zone. If you have something that's a half an inch or smaller, then once again the 10 kilohertz signal will kind of work its way around the object due to various refractive phenomena, and the dead zone will be relatively small. Similarly, if you have 1,000 hertz signal, which means that the length of the wave is 1 foot, then anything that's large, approximately 1 foot in size, the signal is going to, the dead zone is just going to become smaller the higher the frequency. Let's put it that way. So if we drop down to 100 hertz, so basically, you can see we're just multiplying by a power of 10 here, then the wavelength becomes 10 feet. And so objects which are 10 feet wide become essentially transparent to the sound. So in the, we speak at about 1500 to 2500 hertz, which means that the wavelength is 1 foot to a third of a foot, let's say. So objects the size of a light pole are going to be in approximately the same size as the wavelength. They're going to be partially blocked, but mostly the sound will go around. And anything lower, like a muzzle blast, which is lower than a kilohertz, is just going to go right around a light pole, or any object that has a corner that's smaller than that. So let's get back to the cell phone. So we got the cell phone for a person who's over here, and they've got it. This is kind of hard to represent, but they've got it such that it's looking out this direction, and the microphone, let's say, is on the right. So the size of that thing is pretty darn small, and the size of the microphone typically governs how much sound it receives into the microphone, and therefore the amplitude of the conversion from sound to electrical signals. And we call it the sensitivity of the microphone. And each microphone is different, each type of microphone is different, and blah blah blah. They choose and build these microphones for various reasons: frequency response, ruggedness, sensitivity, a whole bunch of other things. And we'll talk about the circuitry in a minute. So anyway, I didn't quite do that right. Let's do something slightly different here. Let's say that we've got the Mandalay Bay in the background. And we've got the shooting coming out of the 32nd floor, coming right at us. And we've got our trusty little cell phone down here, and we've got it horizontal with the microphone to the right. Now, in the case where, and actually what we really know is that the signal's not coming. Oops. Signal's not coming right at us. And I wished I knew how to operate this thing completely. Come on, baby, I know you can do it. Still on a eraser up there, obviously. And it was that color, so let's draw the Mandalay Bay back in. Okay. Now, let's assume that the guy shot, and this is the bullet trajectory. Then we can look at the muzzle blast coming from that as being, as I explained many times, a spherical propagating thing. It has a frequency of approximately, let's say, 600 hertz. So objects at that frequency are going to be transparent. If they're, anything even approaching a foot are going to be transparent. So for our cell phone, which is certainly less than a foot in size, there really is no way that the cell phone is going to block it, and the sound, the direct sound, will reach it, this microphone over there, but it'll be kind of an equal pressure because those lower frequencies are more pressure oriented than they are directional. So there may be two effects going in here. So it's probably going to record that okay. The high frequency sound of the sonic crack, ranges in frequency. It's above, typically it's above 1500 hertz, and it goes all the way up to 10,000 if you're close. So it's a high frequency signal, which is more directional to begin with. But at those frequencies, the cell phone size starts to become very important, and the cell phone itself starts to create a dead zone, depending upon how the cell phone is oriented. So on our side of the cell phone, where we see the picture on the face of it, there's actually a dead zone there for those higher frequencies, where the higher frequencies can't penetrate the phone, and the phone is too large for the sound to bend around it for the higher frequencies. For the lower frequencies, it just bends right around it, and the pressure is approximately equal in all directions, even though there is a small favorability for the sound if the microphone is pointed directly at the source. But anyway, back to the crack. So the crack, being the way that cracks are, is probably produced somewhere over here, let's say, and then it propagates out this way. And so we see that that's closer in directness than not, and therefore that sound would be heard pretty well. However, on the other side, if we put the bullet on the other side of us, and once again, if the crack was generated there and it propagates this way, then we see that that high frequency sound gets interfered with by the cell phone. And if the cell phone is pointed at just the right angle, then the microphone is not going to pick up as strong a signal. So the orientation of the cell phone for these high frequency sounds, i.e. the sonic sonic crack, is more important than it is for the muzzle blast. And so depending upon which way we have our phone oriented, and depending upon which way the bullet is, then we could have some favorable or unfavorable conditions. Now for cell phones that are held like this, even if they're static position where the microphone's pointing down, then there's more complications involved, because in that case the ground reflections are going to become very prominent, or could become very prominent, because every one of these things, both the muzzle blast and the supersonic cracks, will have reflections, and since the microphone is pointed down, it will pick them up pretty big. So in the case where the microphone is pointed down, it's likely that the reflective signals become much more important in signal analysis than if the microphone is pointed left or right or up. So you have to consider that when you're thinking about the loudness of these sounds as they are recorded by a cell phone. The sensitivity, of course, of the microphone varies widely from cell phone to cell phone, even if it's the same manufacturer. So from cell phone to cell phone, it's very, very difficult to say what the absolute intensity of the signal was that was recorded. Now, all these things are somewhat important, but none of them compare to what happens inside the phone, where the signal that gets translated from that pressure wave known as sound into an electrical signal encounters the automatic gain control circuitry. And the automatic gain control circuitry is, as I've explained before, the circuitry that likes to make loud sounds softer and soft sounds louder. It tries to make everything sound the same so that you get a good quality sound. So the cell phone assumes that whenever you push the record button, that you want to record whatever is happening. So let's take two examples. Let's say that let's draw a picture of the venues to begin with. There's the venue. I've seen this picture before. Here's Mandalay Bay, and here's the parking lot out to the east. And let's say we have two locations. We have one location here inside the venue, and we have another location out here almost to the tanks. Now, as you'll recall, there were let's see if that shows up. Yeah, numerous trucks out there that night parked. So there are some obstacles out there. When the muzzle blast from any of the sound of the bullets, broadcasts out in a way that it reaches everywhere, the question becomes, how loud should that be? And we can state fairly conclusively that if you have a direct line of sight, that the muzzle blast, being on the order of 650 hertz for a .223 round fired at 3,200 feet per second, is going to bypass light poles and people and things like that and ultimately reach out there. But these objects are pretty large, so the 650 hertz is going to encounter those trucks, and it's going to have to do some fancy dancing to reach this observer out there. And it does just precisely that. It starts to try to bend around these trucks, and in this case it'll reach there and then it'll reflect and hit that guy. And similarly over here it'll do something similar and reflect, and you might record part of that sound and all that. And that's all great and dandy. It creates echoes and reverberation, which kind of gets messy, but it's okay. So anyway, the question becomes, how loud is it? Well, we know that the sound for a spherical propagation varies with the inverse square of the radius, where radius is the distance from the point of the origin of the sound to wherever we're located. And we can see that in this case the radius has at least doubled, so the sound out there should be at least 1/4 of what it was over there. But that still doesn't give us any absolute numbers. And so what we'd have to do is take the sound over here, which may be as high as 165 decibels at 1 meter at the tip of the gun, 1 meter away from the tip of the gun, and calculate via this formula what it is out there and what it is there. And let's just assume that I could do that in my head, which I can't, and that we came up with that here it should be 109 decibels. These are reasonable numbers, and that out here it should be 90 decibels. Now let's make it a little more interesting on that. Let's make it 70 decibels. Of course, I just erased one of my waves there, but that's okay. So those are the absolute theoretical numbers. And if you had a studio grade microphone and you could record it with good faithfulness at all dynamic ranges without any modification, you could you could measure it on your recording that it's 70 dBs, 109 dBs, but that's not the way cell phones work. When you turn that cell phone on, it's going to try to record the best signal that it can with the best dynamic range that it can. So it's going to do something we call gain adjustment on that microphone, and that's nothing more than amplifying. It's just like the volume control on your radio. You turn it up or you're down. In this case, it's not the speaker, but the microphone, such that when loud sounds are around, the gain goes down so that it can record those loud sounds, and when there's nothing nearby that's loud, it turns the gain up. So what the cell phone does at this position with 109 dB sound, it probably turns the gain down so that it can record that what is still a fairly loud signal. Because on average, 109 decibels would be rock band sound. You know, that's around the same range as a jet engine or a rock band or anything like that. 70 decibels is starting to get around very loud normal talking, or maybe a small lawnmower or something like that. So you can see that they're still in absolute terms fairly loud. But over here the camera is going to turn the gain up. Here it's going to turn the gain down. And so what we end up with is, in the signal, let's say for example the over here the signal in absolute terms was like this with the okay, and then over here with, let's say that the signal was like over at the truck area by the tanks, the signal was something like this. Looks the same but much smaller, right? Well, what the camera is going to do is take that signal here and modifying it to something that looks like this, much smaller. And over here it's going to take that signal and modify it to something that looks very similar to that one. So we end up with these two signals on the recording looking very similar, because that's what cell phones do. That's what these automatic gain control circuitry do. They try to make the signal the same everywhere. It's why, you know, televisions are, you know, the sound is the same except for the commercials, which change the gain purposely so that the commercials are louder. Anyway, and this is the major thing, this automatic gain control circuitry that tries to normalize the sound. And so when you ask the question, or let's make an observation, or let's just ask the question, why is the sound so loud out here behind the trucks when it's the furthest away from the Mandalay Bay? And the answer is simple. Out there it's quieter to begin with, and so any sound is very noticeable. But since the sound in absolute terms is less, the camera will bump the gain up, and it will really bump it up, since when there is no gunfire and the sounds out there are fairly quiet, it bumps the gain up until it gets to a region where it thinks it can handle them, and then you know, leaves it there. When the gunshots come along out here and they reach 70 dB, the gain may not go up and down depending upon how loud the background noise. Over here, you know, where the background noise is probably on the order of 80 decibels with people screaming and everything, you know, that's still lower in intensity than 109. So as those 109 dB signals come, the phone makes a major adjustment in gain downward, and it may make it so much that the screaming actually becomes very low in intensity on the recording. And so that's the dynamic nature of the intensity of the sound on these cell phones. Then you throw in on top of it the directionality of the microphone, and the fact that people are waving their phones around and they're turning them sideways, up, down, left, right, putting them in their pocket. They're holding them sometimes above their head, where they have much better signal than down by their hips, and sometimes they're laying on them and all this, and it's nearly impossible to say precisely or accurately what the absolute value of the intensity of the sound was. So anytime somebody comes along and asks me the question of how loud, why these sound so loud out there, I would say, well, what would you expect them to be? And when they say, I would expect them to be softer, and I'd say they probably are. Well, then why are they sound so loud on the tape? Because the camera adjusted the gain. And it really is, most of the time, that simple. So, then, how do I make any statements when I'm looking at these signals on the spectrogram? Well, it's a guessing game. You have to look at the signals there, and with regards to the gunshots, you have to look at the other signals around, be they people's sounds or sirens or footsteps or whatever, and knowing the approximate decibel level of those various sounds. There's plenty of charts on the internet where you can see, how loud a motorcycle is, how loud a gunshot is, how loud talking is, or a quiet room, or rustling leaves, or the rock bands, or people talking, all that sort of stuff. So when you can find a signal which you know that people talking in an excited level is probably going to be, on the order of, I don't know, I'm quoting it because I don't have that table in front of me, but let's say screaming is 90 dB. I think that's a little high. And, loud talking is 50 to 70, let's say. Then you can start to say that if the gunshot comes in and the camera adjusts the gain upward, then the gunshot sound was probably less intense than the sound, and in that case, the gunshot on the spectrogram is going to be kind of hidden by the talking. But when the gunshot sounds on the spectrogram are just, bold and clear, and the background sounds start to fade out, then you know that the decibel level of the gunshot was substantially larger than the decibel level of the people screaming, which we can kind of get an estimate for. So it's all kind of relative. You have to compare one to the other and blah, blah, blah. But you have all these complications when you start to deal with absolute values for the sound intensity. Even the air itself absorbs sound. So what starts out as 165 decibels, if it were the muzzle blast, it goes out here, and after a couple miles, it gets pretty much absorbed by the air, and so the sound intensity becomes weaker, and plus, it spreads out with the 1 over r squared, which is the major thing for muzzle blast. That's the major attenuating factor in muzzle blast, is this 1 over r squared. With the supersonic crack, which is generated by the bullets, then even if the Mandalay Bay, if they shoot, and the Oasis Apartments is somewhere over there, and the crack is generated, which it is, very close to the building for this geometry. It travels all the way out there. And the supersonic crack, when it was generated, was a nice signal, broadband, all the way from 1,000 hertz to 10,000 hertz. It was this nice spike on the spectrogram starting at 1,000 hertz, let's say, and going on up to 10,000 hertz, which is not uncommon if you're really, really close. Then by the time it gets to over here, it's still subject to this 1 over r squared distance thing, but it's lost almost all of its high frequency components and ends up being a signal that kind of looks like this, where the bottom end is still about 1,000 hertz, and the top end now is about 1,500 hertz. So that high frequency component from 15 to 10,000 gets absorbed by the air at any substantial distance. And so at that distance, the signal for the supersonic crack, which was generated over here, looks very, very similar to the muzzle blast, which would be just slightly lower in frequency, like that. And if you were to double that distance, then essentially the two signals would be almost indistinguishable. Okay, so and that's another effect. The air absorbs the higher frequencies more than the lower frequencies, and that's why elephants, when they're, sub 30 hertz talking, can go miles and miles and miles and still be heard. But the little cheeping bird, even if it made as loud a sound, can't be heard more than a few hundred feet, because those higher frequency signals are directional and they get absorbed quickly. Well, I think that's enough on this. I really wanted to emphasize the complexity in measuring sound, but all the time, people and myself, in fact, sometimes I fall into this little thing of, well, it should have been louder. I'm surprised. In fact, just the other day when I was reviewing one of the videos out here behind the trucks, and that's why I use this example, I said, man, that's a pretty loud gunshot. That sounds like it's right next door. And then he said, Richard, remember, the phone adjusts the gain up because it's a quiet background, and therefore turn the gain up so that it could sound like a normal guy talking. It tries to make everybody sound like they're in the studio. It wants to produce studio-grade recordings as though you got the studio-grade microphone, 2 feet away from your mouth. And that's what it's trying to do. So it adjusted the gain upward, and then when the gunshots came along for a few, in this case, they actually are louder than the talking. It just, kept it kind of at the same level, and therefore, they sound like they're coming from somebody 10 feet away. Whereas over here on the cop corner, where you got sirens going, you got people screaming and cops screaming, and sometimes some of those sounds can be muted. Not typically, but sometimes. And then out here, when you're in the venue and you're behind a building and the bullet went this way, no, excuse me, that's not true, it never goes that way. And the bullet went this way, and you're over here with your little recorder behind that building, and the crack is coming from somewhere this way, there's a lot of signal loss. And so those cracks aren't, and since they're higher frequency, they don't, work their way around the building so much, so the person doing the recording could actually be in a dead zone. And that's true whether it's a building or a taller people in front of you when you're holding your phone down low. Okay, what other weeds can I talk about with this? I think that's enough. Okay, we'll grab you in the next one.